Hey everybody, this is Jared Martin with the Blue and Gray Education Society, and I know I say this every time I do a video, but I am thoroughly excited tonight to have Mr. Chris Hartley on with us. Chris is an author, historian, and what makes him of particular interest to me is long before I even got into Civil War stuff, I was researching Southside Virginia, and if you want to look at our channel's videos, there's a presentation I did on Danville and Martinsville in April 1865. Well, I read this book right here years ago, and it's all marked up inside from references and stuff. And I've been wanting to talk to Chris for a while, and we finally got him on. So, Chris, how are things going for you?
Jared, thank you for having me on. This is great. Great to connect. Great to be on the program today. Things are busy, but really good on this beautiful fall day.
Awesome. Well, tell us a bit more about you. Where you're located, some of the things you're into, your family, stuff like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, sure thing. Live in North Carolina, in the Winston-Salem area. My wife and I we're empty nesters now. We have two adult children and a dog named Brutus that likes to sit on top of my desk when I do some writing there. So he's pretty helpful. But spend a lot of time. I do have a full-time job that keeps me busy during the daytime, but I do a lot of writing on my free time, weekends, and evenings and so forth, and researching, and certainly enjoy topics related to North Carolina history. Um, I would say above all, but have written about Civil War history, have written about World War II history, and certainly just appreciate a lot of what our forefathers did to build this country as we know it today.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I'm like you. I'm trying to find time in my spare time to get some writing in. It can be a struggle sometimes. Uh,
Indeed.
but the main thing we're going to talk about tonight is your book, Stoneman's Raid 1865, which is a fantastic work, probably the seminal work on George Stoneman in the last year of the war. And to kind of kick things off and get started, I know my first introduction to Stoneman was some of the first pages of your book, and that was the band.
Yeah.
I was in 11th grade history class, and our teacher played this song, and Virgil Kane is my name. I served on the Danville train. Well, I was living in Danville at the time. Like I was like, here's this song by this awesome band, no pun intended.
Yeah.
That's mentioning my hometown. So that's what fueled my interest in this subject. So, what first drew you to Stoneman's Raid, and why did you decide to make it the subject of a full length book?
Yeah, it's a great thought about the band, no question, and that song, this just amazing how it kind of draws into Stoneman's Raid. But my connection was a little different. I grew up in Wilkesboro, which is one of the many towns that George Stoneman and his cavalrymen visited in 1865. And there was, and still is to this day, one of those silver black outline North Carolina historical markers right there in front of the courthouse. So today it's the museum for Wilkesboro, but it was a courthouse at the time. Stoneman's Raid. And it just had basically two to three sentences about the raid itself. And it always just struck me growing up in Wilkesboro that the Civil War was something that happened around me, right where I was living. I did not have to go to Gettysburg or Vicksburg or somewhere like that to find out about the Civil War. I could see a place where it happened all around me. And that drew my interest. But the frustrating piece was there was not a lot of information at the time. I went on to school in Chapel Hill and did discover there was some additional information out there, particularly a slim book by Ina Van Noppen, an Appalachian State professor from the 1960s. Incidentally, my dad was in one of her classes, which was kind of a irony there. When he attended Appalachian, but she wrote this slim book, and that was about the only thing that was out there. And when I began doing my own writing and researching, I just sat down one day and asked myself, well, did Dr. Van Noppen find all there was to know about Stoneman's raid, and came to the happy conclusion that there was more to be said about it. In fact, she published her book well before the band came up with that song that you know so well, uh, The Day They Drove Old Dixie Down. Oddly enough, the band is composed mostly of Canadians and, one guy from Arkansas, Levon Helm, but um, probably adds even more to the mystery of how they came across Stoneman's Raid. I'm not sure that's been adequately solved, but nonetheless, a lot of interest there that PQ'd me for sure as a young man to find out more about it. And so I dove in and turned over every rock I could to learn more about the raid and try to present that in a readable format.
Yeah, that's one thing that's always, or been a question of mine is how did, Robbie Robertson from Canada discover, you know, this
Yeah.
one small part of this conflict from a country that he wasn't even from. So, yeah, you're right. Very, very fascinating indeed. Are there any other aspects of the Civil War that you grew up learning about, or any other topics that uh, kind of drew your focus to the Civil War, but just besides the marker in your hometown?
Well, for sure that I was, your typical Civil War student from early on, reading about, learning about battles like Gettysburg and Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, fascinated by the Jeb Stuarts and the Robert E. Lees, the Stonewall Jacksons, people like that, as a young fella, and did a lot of reading and was blessed to have parents that were always good to take me to battlefields and historical sites and so forth, and buy me a lot of books. And so I was hooked early on and could not help but continue to chase that when I went to school and started writing myself. And here we are. I'm still doing it years later after my parents kind of got me started down that pathway.
So you find this small book that was published back in the 1960s. What sparked you to say, "Hey, there's got to be more to this. I'm going to turn this into a full length book."
Yeah, it just seemed to me like the story was awfully incomplete because the raid was massive. The size of that raid, the distance that those soldiers covered was perhaps without parallel in the entire Civil War, if not American military history, in my opinion. Yet there was not a lot in there, right? Dr. Van Noppen did a nice job, and I certainly don't want to be critical of that because she really did a lot for that topic. But there were certainly a lot of holes in the narrative. There was information in there that could have been added. There were resources that perhaps were not available to her as a historian in the 60s that were more readily available when I came along, and places she just simply did not look that really made the narrative richer and more complete, looking at different things.
So before we dive into the topic of the raid, um, when you were researching this and diving into those sources that she didn't look at and going to those places that weren't mentioned, are there any particular moments in your research journey that felt personable or memorable or something that just was a wow moment for you?
Yeah, my one of my um one of the things I like to do is try to turn over every rock, right? See, just look. You never know what you're going to find. 9 times out of 10, you probably won't find anything, but you never know until you look. So I was in Ohio on a business trip some years ago when I was doing some initial research for the book. And there was a unit from Ohio, the 12th Ohio Cavalry, that was in the raid. So being in Ohio, I took a side trip over to the archives there in Columbus to see the state archives there to see what they had available. Didn't find a lot, but I thought, well, let me just check some of the local newspapers from the counties that the 12th Ohio was from. And local newspapers are sometimes just treasure chests of information because, as you well know, soldiers would write letters home that would end up in the newspaper. And if you have the time and the sweat equity look for them, you'll probably find something. Well, I was sitting there, kind of running out of time based on my trip in at the archives in Ohio, looking through a newspaper, and right there was a fantastic article written by one of Stoneman's staff officers detailing the raid. that I don't think anybody had really ever seen before. And that became one of the centerpieces of my research. And also probably a moment where I had to restrain myself from jumping up and yelling in the middle of the archives when I found that too. So that was just a great moment. That going to the National Archives in Washington D.C. to look at some of the records of the regiments involved in the raid and pulling out some documentation, some records that by the look of them had not been opened up and maybe even since 1865. Who knew? Because they were so brittle and falling apart. Just that's the kind of thing that's really fun about the research, though, is getting to look at stuff that people may not have seen in a long, long time, if ever, and that hopefully helped make this book better.
Absolutely, and I can attest to that. There's stuff in this book that, even growing up here and hitting up all the local historical resources, I didn't even know.
Mm.
So I definitely appreciate your thoroughness and willingness to put in that sweat equity because it definitely shows.
Thank you.
So
Great to hear. Appreciate that.
so so focusing on the raid itself, if you had to pick one character from this entire several month event that would be somebody who you would want to sit down and have dinner with, pick their brain. I mean, I know the obvious answer is George Stoneman, but is there anybody else, that stands out to you as this person, is they they've got something special about them.
Yeah, that for me, that's easily William J. Palmer. He was the colonel of the 15th Pennsylvania Cavalry, was the kind of the one of the brigade commanders on the raid, easily the best soldier in Stoneman's command, with perhaps one exception that I'll mention because I need to put an asterisk beside the answer that I'm giving you here. But William J. Palmer, he was like I said, excellent soldier. He went on to become really essentially a railroad tycoon after the war, worth a huge amount of money. Lived in Colorado Springs, Colorado, in his waning years, and he basically owned a house right that still stands today. That's next to Garden of the Gods in Colorado Springs. That's just a gorgeous place. If you're familiar with the Garden of the Gods there, he was so rich though that he basically, after suffering an accident where he became paralyzed and could not travel, he still wanted to have a reunion with his old cavalry regiment from the Civil War. So he basically paid for everybody to come out to Colorado Springs. He was that rich. Pretty awesome. Now, the asterisk I had to mention, there's a second guy. I'm maybe fudging on my answer here, but another famous member of Stoneman's column was Miles Keogh. Miles Keogh, who goes on to be one of the men who rides with Custer at the last stand in 1876 at Little Bighorn and loses his life there. Well, Miles Keogh is right at the side of George Stoneman during Stoneman's raid as they ride through Western North Carolina. So it's pretty amazing that this guy who is just a soldier of renown, essentially, so well known, kind of handsome in many ways, a very flashy guy, even served in the Papal Army before the war. This Irish adventurer, if you will, who came to America, started on the staff of John Buford, was at Buford's side when Buford died from illness, just happened to die at the home of George Stoneman in Washington, D.C. And of course, this is after the Gettysburg campaign and Buford achieving fame there. So Stoneman invited Miles Keogh to join his staff, and the rest is history. Well, how Miles Keogh came to North Carolina with this raid. Fascinating guy for sure. Wore the papal medal around his neck, as he served, and was said to have a skin as ripe as a peach, and wear a uniform that fitted him like a sausage. Kind of a funny way to describe a guy, but he was quite the soldier for sure.
So on those same lines, were there any stories that you found along the way that didn't make it into the book?
Well, if I look over my shoulder here, there is a file folder full of accounts that came to me after the book was published,
Mhm.
regrettably, and I haven't been able to use those at this point. Hope to be able to go back and pull those out at some point and maybe do some supplementary work. But that's a long way of answering. Yes, there were things that did not make the book for sure. You know, and I think a good example of that is the story of York Hill, which is kind of a fortification outside of Salisbury that's still there today. Essentially, some of the trench works are still in can be seen right outside of Salisbury, kind of not far from Spencer. Matter of fact, it's right along Interstate 85 between essentially between Winston-Salem and Salisbury. And there have been some preservationists who have done some nice work to preserve that piece of property and do some additional interpretation and research on it. So, love to see that, just continuing work on the topic of Stoneman's Raid.
Yeah, what did you find was the hardest part in writing this book? Was it, keeping the narrative of it, or trying to mold a narrative, but also keeping the tactical details of the regiments and who was doing what? So, you know, can you talk more about balancing the story versus balancing like the battle aspect of it?
Yeah, it's a great question because it was kind of a struggle to write. You know, funny as a writer, I tell myself that when I'm thinking about a new project, that'll probably be easier to write. It never turns out to be easy to write. Um, but anyway, this particular um, book was challenging because there were so many locations that the Raiders visited. And it would have been really easy for this to turn into a very dull travelogue. They go to Boone and this happens. They go to Wilkesboro and this happens. They go to Elkin and this happens. It could have just become just rote, very, very dull. Kind of just here's where we went from point A to point B. And it was a struggle at times to try to make sure it was every stop was interesting and also explained so it made some sense about what they were doing and why they were in that community.
Right. And that's one thing that I've, in doing my research is I'm fortunate enough where I can focus on just a small part of the raid in just a 3 or 4 day span where it doesn't sound like it's a travel log. Like, oh, he was in Christiansburg and then he
Yeah.
was in Roanoke
Mm.
and then he
Right.
was in,
Right.
because, like you say, it kind of sounds like he's dragging, like people will lose interest in a day by day journal of what's happening.
Yeah.
Um, but in looking at the raid as a whole, um, it's harder to sell, at least from my standpoint, it's harder to sell the idea of a raid to somebody as opposed to here's this large battle that you can go to this one site and have everything. So, what challenges did you have in trying to get this book across the finish line and convincing people that, hey, I'm going to take this one, you know,
Mm.
several months long thing
Mm.
and it's going to be, a great story. And I got what were some challenges you had in getting that across the
Mm.
finish line?
Yeah, quite honestly, that turned out to be a little easier than I expected because one of the unique things about this raid, as you've kind of suggested, is how many places it visited throughout Western North Carolina, Southwestern Virginia, even Eastern Tennessee, down into South Carolina, on into Georgia and even Alabama. There's so many places that this raid touched that I found the interest to be really pretty strong, despite the fact that it's not a Gettysburg or a Vicksburg, right? It was so cool because as the book came out and I was starting to do some speaking engagements around it, it seemed like every little community in Western North Carolina wanted to hear what happened in their town. Um, because there were always stories and legends in every community that this raid left behind. A lot of them weren't true, but just the fact that Stoneman left a lot of legends in his wake really helped this story become one of a lot of interest to people in the area.
And the fact that, Western North Carolina, Southwest Virginia, East Tennessee is an area pretty much largely untouched by the war. You got some fighting in Saltville and, out that way and some minor skirmishing here and there, but now you're taking this corner of
Mm,
the country and you're putting the war right,
yeah.
or you're saying,
Mm,
sure,
mm,
Gettysburg happened here, and, there's battles all over Virginia, but what
mm,
about the one that happened in your backyard? And that's the thing that, people, like you said, find interesting is
mm,
here, even here in Martinsville, I can take people. and to a spot and said Stoneman was here.
Yeah.
Like he wasn't, just riding around a few towns over, or he wasn't, in the Richmond area. He was here.
Yeah.
He was camped here. That's definitely an
Yeah.
awesome thing.
You're absolutely right. And in fact, it's one of the things that I talk a little bit about is that this was probably the biggest single event that encompassed civilians in a broader space. And of course, in Western North Carolina, Southwestern Virginia, it brought more people up close and personal to the war than anything else did from a pure event standpoint. Certainly, there were casualties that people suffered, and economic impact and foodstuffs and so forth. But this is up close and personal. This is the war right in front of you. Um, in fact, it was something that lingered a lot because I was on a research trip in Chapel Hill one day, and um, I'd say many of your viewers would be familiar with the name of Dr. William Powell, who was a wonderful professor at the University of North Carolina. He is the author of Dictionary of North Carolina Biography and just a whole series of books on North Carolina. And I happened just to pass him one day in the library stacks and just introduced myself and said hello and told him what I was working on. Um, and he told me a story. He said, "I'll tell you something about Stoneman's raid." He said around World War II, when the state of North Carolina was putting up those very silver historical markers that I mentioned earlier, um, the state was kind of pushing it to get it done quickly because there was an anticipation that aluminum would be the shortage of aluminum with the war coming on. So state put up a lot of these markers. Well, Dr. Powell told me that a number of those markers in Western North Carolina ended up being thrown into the river, the local river, because locals did not think much of George Stoneman. The legend still lingered at that.
Yeah, and there's a house just up the road from me where now it's been converted into an Airbnb, but it's an old cabin, and like people can still like say like, or they claim that they still have the burn marks from where Stoneman people held the torch up to the walls, and stuff, and that was on the National Historic Registry, like
Yeah.
documentation for it. So here we are 100 years later, and people are still talking about this thing in a government document.
Yeah,
But
that's
to,
awesome.
to, to, to further your point, and um, when you're talking about someone is going through all these towns and villages, the people who are there putting up resistance are the home guard. Like
Mhm.
it isn't necessarily regiments coming in and trying
Yeah.
to, or the different detachments from here and there. You do see that in a few places, but typically the main resistance he sees are the home guard, and
Mm.
that's what puts the war in people's laps. It's what gets them directly involved, and you're
Yeah.
right, you don't really see that many other places in the entire war.
And they performed about like you would expect them to.
Yep.
Yep. A lot of running going on there when they saw Stoneman's Raiders coming through. So
uh, so in your view, what was the single most significant outcome of the raid? Looking back on it 150 years later now, what was the single most significant outcome?
yeah, the raid was really designed to help bring the Civil War to an end. So, it was really part of the grand plan of Ulysses S. Grant and William T. Sherman to bring the war to an end while Grant and Meade are up around Petersburg trying to finish out Lee, the armies of Lee and in that area, while Joseph E. Johnston and Sherman are kind of wrestling across the Carolinas and you know, George Stoneman's raiding column was thought to come in the area to kind of cut off supplies and to eliminate any further means of resistance that Lee's army or Johnston's army could have used to continue the war. Turned out that wasn't necessary. We all know what happened at Petersburg. We all know what happened with Johnston down in eastern North Carolina. So Stoneman's raid in many ways was turned out to be unnecessary. The major impact, in my opinion, was one that lingered well after the war. What Stoneman did and his troops did in the regions that they touched made Reconstruction so much harder. The economic impact, the impact on transportation, the impact on communications, really just everything Stoneman's Raiders did absolutely nothing to help those people recover from the difficulties that were presented to them from the war. And in many ways, that the areas that they went into are still kind of economically depressed to this day. Not totally because of Stoneman's Raid, of course, but it was something that really made a difference in the Reconstruction period. Stoneman's Raiders made that happen.
Right. And it's almost become kind of like a scapegoat, or at least it did for several generations afterwards.
Mm.
That it's, like we said, people still like to bring up Stoneman generations later. Um, so on the flip side of that, what did Stoneman think of this raid in his writings, both during and afterwards? What were his thoughts about this campaign?
Yeah, regretfully, George Stoneman, who became the governor of California some years after the war, a lot of his personal papers went up in flames because the governor's mansion was burned down as he was a governor. Some suspect it was arson because there were a lot of political challenges around Stoneman's belief. Funny to think about in the world we live in. The problems facing George Stoneman in California were about immigration. Imagine that, right? Something that we hear about still to this day. That's what George Stoneman was dealing with then, and a lot of people did not think he handled it well. His house burned down, and with them, a lot of the papers that he might have had that had any commentary about Stoneman's raid or otherwise went up in smoke. So he did not leave a lot about the war, or about the Stoneman's raid particularly in his writings post-war. What I believe is that he thinks that it improved his outlook, improved his standing in the military, because quite honestly, he'd had some difficulties earlier in the war. Not the least of which being captured at Sunshine Church, Georgia, during the Atlanta campaign, captured and sent to Andersonville for a few weeks before he was exchanged. That's pretty embarrassing to be the highest ranking Union general in Confederate captivity. That was George Stoneman. So he was looking for retribution. He was looking for a way to clear his name. And he did perform well in this capacity as well as in a Southwestern Virginia raid that took place earlier, a few months before this raid. And so I think both of those together really helped make a difference for him. They certainly saved his job in many ways because Grant and Stanton were really thinking about getting rid of the guy anyway. And he ended up staying in the U.S. Army for several years after the war. So, whether or not the general public would agree with that assessment is probably a different story. Grant probably never would have agreed with it because he never thought of George Stoneman for the rest of his their collective lives, for sure.
And kind of going off of that and diving into little bit of the personal psychology of Stoneman, do you think that at least earlier on in the war, both in 1863 when he's fighting with Hooker and tries to make this daring move and it doesn't pan out, do you think that part of that um, daringness or I guess boldness was an attempt to kind of gain some of the glory that his roommate at West Point had in Stonewall Jackson?
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a great point. There's no question that he was always looking for a way to kind of rise above his fellow soldiers. And there's a theme of prisons here, right? Because during the Atlanta campaign, when he set off on a raid around Hood's armies defending Atlanta, he was hoping to get down to Andersonville and liberate the prisoners there, not become a prisoner himself.
Right.
And so when Stoneman's raid of 1865 came along, the Salisbury prison was always in his mind as perhaps a way to, um, make up for the fact that he botched the Andersonville attempt and got captured himself. Maybe he could get to the Salisbury prison and free the prisoners there. Regrettably for him, he fell short of that because the prison had been emptied a few days before he arrived, and those prisoners were being exchanged.
And again, going off topic, this is just one thing that I've always wanted to pick your brain on. Um, when Stoneman makes it to Martinsville or Henry Courthouse, um, how much do you think he knew about what was happening in Danville at that time? Speaking of prisons and
Mm.
um, the daring and boldness of Stoneman versus wanting to end the war on a good note. How much do you think about it? Uh, or what do you think he knew about what was going on in Danville with Davis being there and essentially being unguarded just 20 some miles down the road? Do you think he knew anything about that or?
Yeah.
chose not to act on it because he was just wanting to follow orders.
Yeah, great. It is a great observation with all that happening nearby. I think he knew next to nothing about what was going on, because they were moving fast, they were moving hard. A perfect example of that is the outcome of the Appomattox campaign and Robert E. Lee's surrender on April 9th. His his troops or portions of his troops sat still for a day uh, beside the bridges over the Little and Big Otter rivers in southwestern Virginia, hoping orders would come to tell them not to destroy those bridges and move on. But they knew nothing of what was going on at Appomattox and ended up deciding to continue with the raid because they had no information. Nobody informed them. I mean, of course, they were pretty far behind enemy lines, if you will, and just had simply no way to communicate with authorities. Now, Stoneman himself, by that point, was getting ready to head back to Tennessee himself and resume his work with really East Tennessee itself. He's going to depart the raid and leave it in the hands of Alvin Gillum, another pretty interesting guy, kind of for the back half of the raid as it heads west towards Asheville and beyond.
Yeah, to me, that's always one of the most overlooked what ifs of the war, especially where we live is, what if instead
Yeah.
of going south towards Winston, Stoneman had just decided to ride 20 some miles to the east, a simple, 3 to 4 hour cavalry ride, and
Yeah.
what would he have stumbled upon on April the 8th, you know?
Well, and there are some accounts that would suggest that his troops cut rail lines, within an hour or two of Davis passing over that very same rail line as he's headed south from Danville, trying to get on towards Charlotte, essentially at that point.
Right. Yeah, there's that romantic story of the trains passing by
Yeah,
and his Stoneman's men arrive as the train is
yeah,
going over and
yeah. I
uh
don't think it was quite that close. It was probably in the order of hours as opposed to minutes, but nonetheless, the story goes that Davis was told of the near miss and said a miss is as good as a mile. So,
that is correct. So being that the raid came at the very end of the war, do you think its timing kind of diminished its historical importance, or do you think it actually highlights the chaos of the war's closing days?
yeah, both really. I do think it was overlooked in many ways. No reporter was on the ride. Clearly, there were much bigger things happening as these raiders were out in there. Total maybe 5,000 of them. And you had Appomattox, you had Johnston's surrender, you had the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. All this is taking place as Stoneman's men are continuing their ride. And this obscure little raid doesn't get a lot of press as a result of that. It gets some, for sure. It gets noticed. I have a newspaper from St. Louis hanging on my wall over here that the late great Eric Wittenberg gave me that mentions Stoneman's raid, and it's kind of rare to find that for sure.
Yeah, and I I think that this would have been a small footnote as opposed to the daily headlines that were coming out with Lee eventually giving up his position at Petersburg, and then people wanting to know, okay, where's he going next? Um, so you're right. It's interesting that a paper as far away as St. Louis would have something on that.
Yeah.
So with that, how do you feel that this raid fits into the bigger picture of the end of the Civil War with what was going on with Lee, what was going on with Johnson? Where does Stoneman's raid fit in with that?
Yeah, at the end of the day, Lee didn't need any help, right? He did a pretty good job or excuse me, Grant didn't need any help running Lee to ground. That's a better way to put that. Grant and Sheridan and the Army of the Potomac needed no help whatsoever in cornering Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse. Stoneman had raiders in within probably 50 or 60 miles at the time, over kind of in the Lynchburg area, but needed no help. Same was true of Joe Johnston. He was cornered pretty easily by Sherman, ultimately surrendering at Bennett Farmhouse, long way from where George Stoneman was. So at the end of the day, Stoneman's raid really served little purpose from that standpoint of helping to end the Civil War. which I think was I'd like to call it a rate of insurance in many ways. It was sort of a if something happens to where Lee gets away, if something happens to where Johnston's able to elude Sherman, their only place left for them to go is Western North Carolina, Southwestern Virginia. Nothing is left otherwise. And so that's where those soldiers, those armies would have had to go, certainly with Union armies in hot pursuit, but to have a cavalry force already in that area, uh, eliminating infrastructure, um, telegraph lines, wiping out any defensive positions in the area in advance, that certainly could only help bring the war to an end. So it was an insurance play for sure, and a smart one, really, if you think about it from a strategic perspective. Probably a salute to Grant's plan that he had something in place just in case, but it wasn't necessary.
What were people's thoughts on Stoneman as the raid progressed? Because when he starts out in Tennessee, he's in pretty friendly territory.
Mm,
I know, or more not friendly necessarily, but more sympathetic territory. And does
mm,
does he see that anymore as he goes through the mountains?
mm. Yeah, there's always a mix of people that meet George Stoneman and his troopers. Western North Carolina is famous for having some Unionists living in the up in the mountains. Farmers who really never thought much of the Confederacy, never saw much benefit, and tried to stay as loyal as they could. Well, expectations among many of those families were pretty high that Union troops would treat them differently. Union troops, Union cavalrymen did not treat them differently. They had a different objective in mind. They were, as I mentioned before, they had objectives to reach. If they had to take empty somebody's corn cribs or take their horses or whatever kind of food that they needed, they would not hesitate to do that, whether or not you were a Unionist or a Confederate at heart. So it left some bitter people in the wake of George Stoneman for sure. The one benefit, though, after the war, there was and I'm sure you're familiar with it, and many of your viewers are as well. The Southern Claims Commission was put into existence to receive claims from people who lived in the South who could demonstrate that they were loyal to the Union. Then they could get compensation for any damage or any kind of acquisition of supplies that might have been visited on a household. And so the National Archives is full of those claims commission papers with affidavits and claims against Stoneman's raiders asking for compensation. You know, it's a resident in Boone might write, on, this day in March of 1865, George Stoneman came to my plantation, and he gives full information about exactly what happened, exactly what was taken. Two or three neighbors would provide corresponding affidavits to back up the claim. Fabulous source of information that kind of gives us an insight on what civilians endured. Um, Now, if you look at the archival records, though, the ones who were actually approved, the claims that were approved is kind of, so big, and the ones that were denied, a lot more records that
Right.
were denied in those areas. But it's a great source of information, and that's where you read about some of those Unionists who were not really happy about how Stoneman's troopers took care of them when they passed through the area.
Right. And what got me thinking about that was, Stoneman launches this raid in as March of 1865 from East
Mm-hmm.
Tennessee, and then just a month later, a resident of that same area would be president. Would
Hmm. Yeah.
would become president. So he's starting out, in um, fairly fairly friendlier territory than what he was used to. Um, so we kind of hit or touched on Stoneman's thoughts or what we kind of can assume from the raid, but did you find anything in your research about what staff officers were feeling and experiencing during the raid? I mean, because like you said, they covered more ground in a matter of a few weeks than probably anybody else had before, even Jackson's foot cavalry.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. That I it's kind of interesting. You look at the experiences of some of the officers on the raid, the staff officers on the raid. There was certainly some confusion from time to time about what was trying to be accomplished and why the route was taken. There were also incidents where officers and soldiers alike found that fiery liquid that is so well known in the mountains of North Carolina, of a little bit of moonshine, and probably dipped a little bit too much into that to the point that Stoneman had some moments of severe anger taking it out on his troops. But there were other staff officers officers in general, who enjoyed the raid immensely. One of my favorites is Alan Frankenberry. He was an officer on the raid, and he has a diary at West Virginia University, and his diary is absolutely full of every single town, almost without exception, he goes to with Stoneman's Raiders. Frankenberry manages to meet the prettiest young lady and get a full meal from some host in town. So he's going from town to town, visiting with young ladies and eating good food. And so he enjoyed himself immensely on this raid. Not true of everybody on the raid, but Frankenberry, you got to have a hat off to him for his ride.
So someone once told me when you're writing a book, it's kind of a double-edged sword. You're putting info out there in the world, but then as soon as it's published, then you start discovering things that, like you said before, that you could have included, should have included, might would have included if you'd known it prior to publishing. So since your book was published, have you discovered anything that has changed your perspective or deepened your perspective of the raid?
Yeah, not. I don't think I found anything that has really changed my perspective, really about the raid. Um, if anything, I think it's been very humbling to hear people talk about the book and some of the things that were in it, and about how it really just added to what we knew about the war. Certainly, I regret that it was published before everything I could find was added to it. Always, as you well know, the challenge for a writer and researcher is when to stop researching. Um, it's I'm not sure there's an easy answer for that one. And to this day, as I mentioned, I'm still finding resources and accounts. A gentleman that lives in Georgia turns out was the as a relative of one of the cavalry officers on the raid, and shared with me a full diary he has of his ancestor, which is a great account. But hopefully, we can figure out how to make that see the light of day at some point.
And I was going to ask too, since the publishing of this, have people who have had ancestors in this on either side, reached out to you and say, hey, I've got this thing that you might be interested in, or, you know, here's this story that, you mentioned briefly, but here's a lot more on it.
Yeah, it indeed does happen. One of the treats of doing a book like this is you always meet ancestors and relatives, and I don't think I've given a single talk about this raid without somebody coming up to me and telling me about their relative, their ancestor, who was visited by Stoneman himself, or
Yeah.
encountered the raiders directly, right? And a lot of it is not always accurate, but boy, it just tells a story by and large of itself when people have those stories and the rage remembered in families that way generations later.
And, if you have never read this book, it doesn't matter if you're, not even a Civil War enthusiast. If you're just interested in just a great story, or if you've lived in Western Carolina, Southwest Virginia, East Tennessee, and want to know more about the history, I highly suggest picking up this book and reading it. It's well worth the read. And um, what do you hope that the readers, whether they be Civil War enthusiasts or just people who are wanting to know more about the place in which they live, what do you think, or what do you hope is their biggest takeaway from reading this?
Yeah, it really, I appreciate those comments, Jared, about the book. It really, for me, does get back to where it all started for me with that historical marker as a kid and everything. The Civil War was a massive, life-changing event, world-changing event, essentially. It was not limited to the big battlefields that we all know so well. It was not limited to the famous soldiers that we all know well. It affected almost every person in the entire country as we know it, especially Southerners who might have been kind of in the line of actions as they took place. And so I think it's really important to kind of peel back those layers and think about the things that are happening at the and the quote unquote home front, the things that are happening for the individual person. That this war had tremendous impact for really anybody who lived during that time frame, and that to me is the story that came out loud and clear about this raid.
So one final question, and if we can't talk about this yet, I'll edit it out in post production here. Um, you put this book out, like I said, it's the seminal work on Stoneman's Raid, I believe. But you also have a new book coming out in the near future. We're recording this in October of 2025, but you have a new book coming out that's on the horizon. Do you want to talk more about that for a second?
Yeah, be happy to. So in January of next year, January 2026, um, my publishers, Savis Beatty, will be releasing my next book, which is a biography of Daniel Harvey Hill, D.H. Hill, very famous Civil War figure, Confederate general, perhaps one of the most controversial Confederate generals ever to put on that uniform. It's the first full-length biography of Hill that's ever been published. There was an excellent book that was done, more than 50 years ago by Hal Bridges about Hill, but it's not a full biography, not a complete biography. And so it is my hope that this story about D.H. Hill will really tell his full story for the first time, cradle to grave, and follow that very fiery, very critical soldier throughout his lifetime, and it's he is quite the character. I'll tell you that. Supremely religious, the brother-in-law of Stonewall Jackson. In fact, he is the guy who brought Stonewall Jackson to the Presbyterian Church. D.H. Hill is such an impact on Stonewall Jackson's life and vice versa. And of course, D.H. Hill goes on to figure prominently in the famous Lost Order during the Maryland campaign. He's associated with that, blamed for its loss in many ways. He also is associated with the famous Generals Revolt under Braxton Bragg in the fall of 1863 after Chickamauga and around the time of Chattanooga. He's involved in the Gettysburg campaign. Some say that he robbed General Lee of some troops that might have ended up on participating in Pickett's charge if it were not for Hill arguing with Lee and holding those troops back as the Confederate Army in Northern Virginia marched north towards Gettysburg. So fascinating character, lived quite the life. Was said to be one of the bravest individuals ever to walk on a battlefield. So hopefully it'll be a good read for everybody. Thanks for
Yeah,
asking.
yeah, and we'll definitely have you on, when that comes out and we get a chance to read it. And I was just reading about D.H. Hill the other day when I was doing some research for a quick video we made about Wise Fork,
Mm,
and he's there, and he's one of those characters who, if you want to know a good complete story of the Civil War, you can just follow where he is, really.
mm. It's remarkable how he shows up in a lot of places, for sure. Some say that he was first and last with North Carolina troops because he commanded really in the first major quote unquote victory of the Civil War at Bethel Church in Virginia in 1861, and then he's there at the end at Bentonville, commanding troops there as well. So it is a long journey with him. And sometimes it was a pretty long journey for me too, I can assure you.
Well, we're definitely gonna look forward to that coming out. And like I said, we'll have you back on when that comes out. Chris,
Appreciate it.
we thank you so much for coming on and talking with us more about Stoneman's Raid. And if people want to purchase the book, what's the best place to purchase the copy
Yep.
of Stoneman's Raid?
Yeah, what I will tell you is that supplies are dwindling. So my publisher for this book no longer has any copies of that book left. They are sold only on Amazon today or individually through me. So those are your best options. And I will tell you that that first edition copy that you have in your hands, there aren't a ton of those copies left. And so once that goes out of print, I don't know if there'll be any plans to republish or not. That remains to be seen. So,
Well, we'll definitely link the Amazon link in the description
mm,
below. And like I said, we thank you so much, and we will definitely be talking to you again once your book on
mm.
DHO comes out.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed being with you.